Hey, church, today we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel 18. And I just like to kind of pull out, I think, three ideas out of this chapter that stood out to me. Chapter 18 comes right after chapter 17. In chapter 17, David slays Goliath and becomes a champion in Israel. And in verse 1 of 18, David is going to talk about the relationship that David is going to begin with Jonathan, Saul's son. And it says in verse 1, it says, "Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt." One of the things that as you look at Jonathan and David that comes to mind is just the incredible gift of friendship. I don't know, a lot of people, it seems like, don't have relationships like this, but this is such a deep friendship, and it's gonna give so much life to both Jonathan and to David. It says that their hearts were knit together, and that Jonathan loved David as himself, that there was such a fidelity to one another, that really they were for each other from this day forward. That relationship was going to be tested. We talked about it a few days ago, but Jonathan would have normally been in line to inherit the throne after Saul, and yet David was going to do that. That's a hard thing for a friendship to go through, but it never did. And even after Jonathan was dead, David still honored him for his entire life. And it just makes me think, man, I've been so grateful for the friendships that God has given me in my life, and I've gained so much strength because of them, so much help. When I've walked through difficult times, David's about to walk through a very difficult time. To have Jonathan there with him is such a powerful thing. If you don't have those friendships, I want to encourage you to ask God for a friend like that, to ask God for a Christian friend who's going to pray for you, who's going to hold you up, who's going to hold you accountable and encourage you. The second thing that stands out to me is that David has been tested already in his life. He was tested when he was a shepherd with obscurity and anonymity. He was just out there by himself and not recognized. When Samuel came to anoint the next king in his father's house, he wasn't even considered. They didn't even call for him to come in. When his brothers were off to war, he was still out tending the sheep. And so he's kind of had that test of the difficulty of not being known, but now he's going to be tested by success and stardom. Now he's going to skyrocket into fame, and that's going to be a big test on David's life. It says in verse 6, "It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out from all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s.'" So the second line is what really grabbed the attention of Saul, but David is being celebrated everywhere he goes. He slew the giant. He defeated the Philistines. He's now this hero throughout Israel. And that's going to be a test. Success is a big test. A lot of times we prepare for the difficulty, the struggle of trying to attain some goal. And rarely do we think about the test that comes when you've attained the goal. And a lot of times that's where people end up failing. And so for David, the test is going to be, how are you going to deal with this newfound fame, this newfound stardom? Are you going to become prideful? Are you going to become arrogant? Are you going to let it go to your head? The third thing that stands out here is that Saul is also being tested by this. And Saul is going to fail this test. Saul is going to become so jealous of David that his mind and his heart is going to be turned from the calling that God has had on his life to trying to tear David down, to trying to attack David. It says in verse 8, "Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him, and he said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000, but to me they have ascribed thousands, and now what more can he have but the kingdom?' Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on." Saul's heart was turned against David, and really for the next almost 20 years, David's life is going to be marked by this problem that he has with Saul. One of the things that you can encounter in this life is when someone above you in authority over you doesn't like you or is out to get you. That can be one of the most difficult positions to be in, whether it's a boss or sometimes a family member or maybe a church leader or someone who has it out for you. They've made up their mind about you and it's not good. And so now they're going to try to make your life difficult, or they're going to try to turn. That's what Saul is going to do to David. Saul is going to try to use everything he has to try to tear David down. It says in verse 10, now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house. And while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual, and a spear was in Saul's hand, Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. In fact, the thing that was driving Saul the most mad about David was that God was with David and he wasn't with Saul. He had departed from Saul. And sometimes it's your virtue or your Christianity that someone can take offense with. It's that they can, your faith is what they hate about you. It drives them crazy because it says something about their own walk with God, their own relationship with God. In fact, the second half of the chapter is right there you saw Saul tried to throw a spear at David and wanted to pin him against the wall, wanted to stick the spear through his chest and anchor him in the wall. He really wanted to kill him. It was a murderous spirit. But Saul's going to pivot in a minute, and he's going to try to get David to marry one of his daughters. And that's not going to work because David's going to say, I'm not even worthy to marry your daughter. And then he's going to try again, and it's going to be successful in that he's going to marry his daughter Michal to to David, and so that Saul can keep David close so he can, try to have access to him and try to control him at any time. And so he's got these plans of how he's going to bring him down. And sometimes they'll take on different forms. Sometimes it's direct, and sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's low key. And you think, if you're David, what do you do in this situation where a powerful person like Saul, he's the king, he can do anything he wants. He's also been anointed by the prophet to be king. He has God's blessing to be an authority at this time in his life. That's going to leave later on. But if you're David, what do you do in that situation? And there's just one verse that sticks out with me that I think is so important. It's verse 14. It says, David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. So even when a powerful person like the king is working against David, David can still have confidence that his life is in God's hands, that his future is in God's hands, and he doesn't have to have the king like him. He doesn't have to have the king be on his team because God is the one that is going to take care of him. As he puts his eyes on God, he can be confident that God is going to have his way in his life. And it's like the verse in Hebrews says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. So we can, in whatever situation you're in, whether the whole world is against you, whether your boss is against you or important people are against you or whatever, the person who's in charge of your promotion at work or the person who's in charge of your future in some way is against you, you can put your confidence in God and you can fix your eyes firmly on Jesus, say, I'm going to walk with you and God will bless you. God bless you and we'll see you tomorrow.